Today we're looking at Unit 3, Notes number 2. We're going to explore U.S. overseas influence. So, open door policy. China is a war-torn, carved up by foreign powers, and is more of an outpost than a nation. So many countries see China as a wealth of resources and want to kind of have a piece of the pie. But China is an independent country and it's a very large country, so it doesn't get taken over, it doesn't become a territory. Instead, countries have a sphere of influence in China. So countries like the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, it's like they stake out claims to certain regions. If you look at the map at the bottom, different color-coded areas are these spheres of influence for France is in yellow, Japan is in purple, Russia's in red, and so within this sphere of influence, those countries can trade with that area, that region. They have access to resources that are there. So by the time the U.S. wants to be involved in this, there really isn't any good area left. So the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issues open notes to each nation in China. He is proposing to openly share trade access in China without cutting out the U.S. And so this would benefit the U.S. the most because we currently, at the time, did not have a sphere of influence in China, whereas other countries did. But it would also benefit those other nations because now they wouldn't be limited to just their region. They could openly trade with any part of China, and so the U.S. would also be able to participate. So when John Hay issued this kind of open notes, open door policy, no one really agrees to it, but they don't reject it. So the U.S. is claiming a stake in this valuable market and is able to sell goods and make money. So this is a political cartoon to kind of illustrate this idea of the open door policy. You have the Uncle Sam figure holding this key. On the key it reads American diplomacy, and you have the other individual standing outside kind of in cultural, country appropriate attire to kind of distinguish where they're from. And so he's kind of saying we now have this open door. I'm allowing everyone equal access to China, and China is behind the door. So the Boxer Rebellion. So with all of these different foreign countries in China, Chinese resentment of these foreign devils began to boil over. The Chinese people did not necessarily like the Western influence that was coming into their country. China had been very isolated prior to this, so Westerners have a different style of dress, they look different, they have different religion, and as these traders are coming in, it begins to kind of change their country. So of course they don't like that. One group known as the Boxers openly began to attack foreigners, missionaries. The goal of the Boxers was to wipe China clean of all Western influence. Even Chinese Christians were targets. So Chinese people who had been converted by the missionaries, the Boxers also attacked them because they felt that was a change to their country. So American and European alliance was against this rebellion. We're trying to put it down because while the rebellion is happening, it puts a stop to trade, to buying and selling, and so the rebellion needed to be over in order for business as usual to continue. So the American and European countries were united in terms of ending the rebellion. So their alliance of troops killed thousands and began to crush the uprising. U.S. economic and military role in China set up huge American influence in Asia. So this rebellion actually increased support for the open door policy. It actually helped the U.S. gain kind of good standing with the other European nations in terms of their participation and their help in ending the Boxer Rebellion. So it's now the 1890s and America is looking to flex its muscles. The U.S. looks to exert its power in the Western Hemisphere. Spain Spain's imperial control in the West has begun to deteriorate, and American interests began to conflict with Spanish interests. So, as our country is getting stronger, some more traditional European powers, like the Spanish, are beginning to decline. Tensions in Cuba. So Cuba was the center of tension between Spain and the U.S. If you look at the map, Cuba is only about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's very, very close to the U.S., or what did I say, 60 miles off the coast of Florida. The U.S. had always wanted that area. However, Spain had been in control of it for a very, very long time. So nevertheless, just like in Hawaii, U.S. firms invested millions of dollars in Cuban sugar, so that we had a huge interest in Cuba in terms of keeping our business profitable, keeping relationships with the country and the people and businesses well. So, but then in 1895, led by Jose Marti, Cubans began to revolt for independence from Spain. So the Cuban people wanted to be independent. They did not want to be controlled by a foreign power. Very similar to the American Revolution when we had Great Britain overseeing the American colonies. So American opinion was split over the Cuban Revolution. Some supported Cuba because they felt that their struggle was similar to the American colonists and that, we should support them in their quest. But others had opposed it because of the businesses and the sugar investments and that a revolution could damage that relationship. So here's a map of Cuba, and again we can see just how close the tip of Florida is to Cuba. We also see Havana. Havana is very close there, and so we will be talking about Havana in one of the later slides. So let's take a look at the three causes of the Spanish-American War. What caused us to enter into the war? So first cause would be yellow journalism. And so what yellow journalism is, it's a sensational style of reporting that exaggerated stories to attract and enrage readers. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst encouraged it in order to sell papers. So they both own two huge newspapers, and their goal is to make money and sell papers. What sells papers but exciting stories? So they weren't necessarily concerned with like writing facts and delivering just like truth. They were concerned in, what are catchy headlines? What's going to make people want to buy this newspaper? And so they feel like a war would be exciting and people would want to read about it. So reporters demonized the war tactics of the Spanish, especially General Valeriano Weyler. So they're making the Spanish seem like the enemy. They begin to call him the butcher. And so they want to see war happening. And so this is a quote from William Randolph Hearst. He says, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." So his goal is, let's kind of get public opinion to support the war. The U.S. will eventually support Cuba in their quest for independence, and we'll have something interesting to write about. So this yellow journalism begins to kind of change and influence people's opinion. So next we have the Delome letter. So the New York Journal publishes a private letter from the Spanish minister to the U.S., Enrique Delome. This letter was never meant to be seen. In the letter, Delome calls the U.S. President William McKinley weak and a bidder for the admiration of the people. So basically insulting our president. So when this letter gets published, Americans are very upset. Americans didn't necessarily love McKinley, but they didn't like the fact that a Spanish minister was insulting our president. So again, creating more tension between the people, creating more public opinion in favor of the war. So lastly, we see the explosion of the USS Maine. President McKinley had sent the USS Maine to the Havana Harbor in 1898 to protect American lives and property. So we're not at war. We're not supporting the Cuban independence yet, but there are businesses in Cuba. We want to make sure that everything is safe and to have an American presence there. So on February 15th of 1898, an explosion rips the USS Maine in half, and it sinks in the Havana harbor. 260 of the 350 sailors on board were KIA, killed in action. So now you have a loss of American lives. So journalists, the yellow journalists, go to work. They begin to write stories. There's photos. They begin to do sketches of the wreck. And the reporters blame Spain for using a cowardly secret weapon without any evidence. This ship exploded. They're saying it was a secret, like a torpedo that went, and it had to be the fault of the Spanish. So the mast, the tall part of the ship, and the bell of the main are sent back home, and Americans are demanding revenge. They feel that the Spanish were responsible for this act. We should declare war. And the U.S. also has other intentions. We secretly hope that if we help help Cuba become independent, then we can exert our influence over Cuba. Get rid of the Spanish influence, and we could have a say-so. So while it would be altruistic of us to help them in their quest for independence, like always, the U.S. has ulterior motives. So one last slide. So this is the actual mast from the USS Maine. My husband and I visited it at Arlington National Cemetery. They have a really nice display there to honor those men that had perished in the explosion. And this is the end of the notes. So make sure you do your summary. You filled out your notes paper. Go back and look at your key terms.